All right, here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about research I've done at Duke with colleagues at Harvard and all over the place. I'm going to talk about, in fact, let me get right to it. Let's start with some of the myths I hope to shatter today. Okay, now read through them. I mean, you read in the newspapers and the media about the fact that the United States is in trouble because we're not graduating enough engineers and scientists. And then Bill Gates and company go around about justifying their outsourcing by saying we're going where the skills are. And then everyone talks about math and science education being critical. I mean, of course, math and science is good, and it's equated with global competitiveness. So therefore, teaching more math and science is the way we're going to keep our edge, and the United States will reign supreme forever. And then my colleagues in academia talk about the importance of basic research, that to keep our global edge, we need to keep investing more in research. And then in the immigration debate, everyone agrees that everyone in Silicon Valley at least agrees that skilled immigrants fuel the economy, and therefore we need more H-1B visas. And then when you get to entrepreneurship, the image is that it's the young college dropouts who fuel Silicon Valley. And then the common belief is that America is a leader in workforce development. These are great, except look at the title I have up there. I call them myths. Okay, and so in the next hour or so, I'm going to try to shatter as many of these as I can. First of all, what are the justifications for some of these arguments? That you hear everywhere that India and China graduate zillions of engineers, the US doesn't graduate zillions, therefore we're in trouble. And then we keep talking about the fact that Americans rank below others in maths and science tests and so on and so on. These are some of the common justifications.
Just to tip your hand a little bit, you're going to argue that indeed the U.S. is in trouble, but for a different set of reasons.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So
The US is in big trouble.
You're not here to tell us we can relax and take it
No.
easy. But what you're saying is let's figure out what the real issues are and address those rather than things that may not be.
Because what happens is that when you base national policy on myth, you come up with the wrong solutions. And if we did everything that's being prescribed, my belief is that the US would be still where it is. It may even be backwards. And we're going to lose our global edge because we're fixing the wrong problems. So that's the moral of my presentation. And I'm going to try to prescribe some new solutions at the end of it. All right, I'm going to talk about some of my research at Duke. As Professor Chesbrough mentioned, I'm a tech executive who joined academia about 5 years ago. And what happened when I joined Duke was that I felt like a movie star. I'd been in the media so much that when I joined the Masters of Engineering Management program there, students lined up to see me. And I felt really cool being a professor and having students coming and flocking to see me. But my first day there, out of 20 students I met, 5 of them asked me a question that I couldn't answer. They said, Professor, what courses can we do that'll make our jobs outsourcing proof? And I'm thinking, what the heck are these kids worried about outsourcing for? These are Duke Masters of Engineering Management graduates. I mean, these are people I would have been bending over backwards to hire during my tech days. Why are they worried about their jobs? It didn't click with me why they were asking that question. And then they started asking about outsourcing and India and China, and I was baffled by these questions. And then they asked me what courses I should do. I had no clue. So basically, my dean at the Pratt School of Engineering at Duke said, Vivek, do what academics do, research the topic. If there's any particular notion that you don't agree with, then go and do some research. And she told me about this practicum that I could do in which students would work with me on research. So I thought it was really cool, and we started doing research. And for the next 50 slides, everything I'm going to be talking about has been done by students like yourselves who did the research. And we've gotten a lot of attention with the work that we've done, and all student-led. It's not a bunch of PhDs sitting there in their ivory towers doing formulas and publishing papers. This is a bunch of kids at Duke publishing groundbreaking research. First of all this hoopla about engineering graduation rates. What we found basically was that true, China and India graduate a lot of engineers, but they're not the same as American engineers. That the numbers we were using, the numbers that are being put out by the Chinese government include everything, including the kitchen sink. They include degrees that we would not call engineering in the United States. In India, they counted computer science and IT as engineers. In my books, computer science, a web designer isn't an engineer. I mean, you can stretch it and call them that, but that's really not the way we think of engineers in the United States. Now, by the way, I don't think is this working? Can you hear me clearly? It is, all right. So essentially what we found was that we weren't comparing apples with apples. And this whole debate was based on incorrect comparisons. The 70,000 US number includes international students. And I'm going to show you the breakdown of international versus domestic students in a few slides later. All right? So what were the real comparative numbers? What we found basically was that in 2004, if you counted the Indian way, which means you counted computer science and IT as engineering, there was no way of breaking the Indian data down to take CS and IT out of it. So we said, OK, let's count everything the Indian way. Because the Chinese also included CS and IT in their numbers. And they included 50 other professions in their numbers. We found basically was that the US and India graduated about the same number. The Chinese numbers are very high, but I put a big asterisk there saying these data are suspect, because that's what the Chinese government puts out, and you can't challenge them. We tried calling up, I actually had my students call up 200 different institutions in India and 200 institutions in China. The Indians couldn't tell us, I mean, we called up the registrar of JNU, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He couldn't tell us how many colleges he had or how many students they were graduating. They had no clue what was going on there. The Chinese thought we were working for the CIA, and they clamped down. And they must have sent emails to each other all across the board, because after the first 3 or 4 calls, we got the same story everywhere, saying, please send us a fax, and you have to get clearance from the government before we give any more information. But in any case, the Chinese numbers were high, as I'm going to show you, but they were suspect. And then after this research, I mean, I talked about my being a tech executive joining academia. We published a little paper on the graduation rates of engineers. And before I knew it, this was front page news everywhere. You'd have thought that I invented a cure for cancer with this silly little paper we published which said that here are what the graduation rates are. So much so, 4 months after I published the report, my dean got a call from the White House. They invited her to the State of the Union address, where she sat next to the 4 of the president's advisors, the head of the Department of Education, the head of the Council of Competitiveness, 4 of the president's advisors talking about Professor Wadhwa's research. I thought it was pretty cool that the White House was reading my stuff. So I decided to stay in academia and do more research. And what happens in academia is that when you publish a paper, all the academics in the world start descending on you because you're stepping on their turf. They start challenging you left, right, and center, coming up with silly little reasons why your stuff is false. So I had no idea what hit me. It was for about a month after publishing this silly little report, I was in the midst of a firestorm. Emails, attacks, op-eds, TV interviews. Like I said, it was just amazing what was going on. But when the dust settled, I took everyone on. Being a tech exec, you learn to be pretty ruthless, and you don't take garbage from anyone. So I was a tech exec. I'm still a tech exec at heart. So I took everyone on, wiped them out. And then when the dust settled, there were some pretty intelligent questions that came up from academics, saying, all right, we accept that those numbers are, what you put out are more or less accurate. Then why are companies going overseas? If India isn't graduating many engineers, why is it becoming an IT superpower? That was a good question. And then the question is, what are the differences between Indian and Chinese engineers and Americans? Another good question. So a lot of the numbers I reported were 2-year degrees and diplomas. Why would smart Indians and smart Chinese spend all their time and money doing these 2-year degrees when they don't matter? Because if I went according to the US debates, to innovate, to produce technology, to be an engineer, you need to have a 4-year degree. That's what the common debate is. That's why we keep arguing about degrees in the United States. If those degrees don't matter, then why are Indians and Chinese doing that? They're not dumb. I mean, this is life savings for many parents in those countries. Why would they do these degrees if they don't matter? That was another great question which I couldn't answer. And then the question was, what's been the long-term trend? So next, another semester, another project, another set of students, and we decided to do a scientific study. I basically contacted all the top academics I could come across, all the people who had been contacting me. We developed methodologies to do follow-up studies and so on. And what I realized was that they were useless. These guys, people had no idea what they were talking about. So we went to the source. We went to the Lou Dobbs companies that were exporting America, quote unquote, and we said, let's ask them why they're going abroad. So I'm going to tell you why companies said that they're going abroad. When it came to shortages of engineers, if you ask a kid, is there a shortage of ice cream in America? The answer would be yes, there's a shortage of ice cream. If you ask a tech CEO, is there a shortage of engineers? What do you think they're going to say? Of course there's a shortage of engineers. Until they have applicants banging down their doors, begging for jobs, taking low salaries, and their attrition rates go down to 0, they're not going to be happy. So this whole debate in the United States about shortage of engineers, it's really a bunch of people expressing opinion which isn't founded in reality. When we came down to it, We didn't ask, as a tech CEO, I knew that the things you look at aren't, what counts basically is, do you have to pay bonuses to people? When you make job offers, what percentage of the people you make offers to accept your jobs? When you folks look for a job, you don't apply to one company and wait for them to respond to you. You put your resume out to dozens of companies, and if you're halfway smart, you get more than one job offer, right? So when we analyzed the responses, 47% acceptance rates, 80% said that stayed constant. Less than a fifth offered sign-up bonuses. When you analyze all this data, there was no indication of a shortage in the United States of engineers. So all of this noise that you hear about engineering shortages, shortages of science are just bogus, not true. And then this was a big surprise, because if you looked at the chart I put up before, which was China was all the way up there, and then the US was here and India was below that. What should have been the response to this question is that India has severe shortages of engineers because it was growing as an IT powerhouse. Okay? The United States should have been stable. China should have been the one with the ample supply. But the responses we got were the exact opposite. This didn't make sense. Because when I published that report, I was giving very bold pronouncements about how China was now going to take over the world because of their high graduation rates and how they were doing everything right. And I was basically very down on India, so much so that the Indians declared me a national villain, and the Indian media wouldn't talk to me. They absolutely hated me in India for calling them out with their engineering rates. But it is what it is. So, when we did this follow-up study, I was really surprised when we saw this chart. It didn't make sense to me. And I asked my academic friends what it means, and they couldn't figure this out either. They said, well, statistical error, God knows what. I mean, they had all these fancy terms for it, but this slide didn't make sense. And then we asked, how do the Indians and the Chinese compare? Surprise, the Americans are more productive or equally productive. They do equal or higher quality work, but the Indians and Chinese cost less and they work harder. No surprise here. But if I was an American saying this, they would have descended on me for being a racist. But being an Indian saying that the Indians and the Chinese work harder, I could get away with it. But the fact is, that's the way it is. This is why companies go overseas, because they can get cheap labor who work very hard, who basically do whatever they're told. This is the reality of why companies are going overseas. Degree requirement. This was a big shock again. Nearly half of them said that they didn't care about degrees, that they'd hire anyone who was halfway smart as long as they could do the job and employ them. Big surprise, because this goes contrary to all the debates we have in the United States about engineering education. If education doesn't matter, then why this obsession with bachelor's degrees? So again, you do a research project and you come up with all these mystical results which you try to interpret, but one research project leads to another. Why are companies going abroad? It's all about salaries. It's all about closeness to market. Question?
Yeah, one question to put the 2 or 3 year bachelor degree to perspective. How long is the high school years in
I think in India and China it's 12 years. Do the Indians and Chinese, can you confirm that? Yeah, it's the same. Yeah. So basically, it's all about cost and markets. That's why companies are going abroad. All right. So again, another study made front page news again, and I was beginning to enjoy this. Kicking up, as Professor said, I mean, I was really beginning to enjoy my role as a provocateur. It was really cool being able to make front page news every time you published a silly little study. And I also write for Business Week, so I could write about my own stuff and fan the flames even more. So when the dust settled on the second study, there were more good questions, and we actually went to India and China to figure out what was going on there, because you can only do so much research being at a distance. So we actually went there, and we asked them where this was headed. And nearly all of them said that outsourcing would gain momentum and continue. And all the execs of Indian and Chinese companies talked about how their R&D divisions were going to be the center of the universe for their companies. You don't hear that here in Silicon Valley. Here, basically, companies are very shy about talking about their outsourcing operations. So they don't talk about it. You go to India and China, and they boast about it. Question?
Is the growth going to be primarily because of the growth of the companies themselves, or are they going to be taking more of a share of what's available within the company?
What we heard was that they're going to be taking more of a share of what's in the companies. and they're growing. You go to talk to the Indian executives, the Chinese execs, they're very boastful about how their divisions are going to take over the world. So they weren't concerned about taking away American jobs. They were concerned about building up their own empires. That's what we learned in face-to-face meetings with many companies. Question?
Just the shortage of engineers. Is that because you've taken a snapshot? So in the US, there used to be a shortage. It's now being solved because
Great question. My next slides.
Okay.
Let me get to that. That's a great question. So, basically the question was, what's been the long-term trend, and do these higher-level PhDs and masters even matter? I mean, before we talked about low-level IT, the question is, if R&D is going abroad, do these degrees matter? And your question about, is this a short-term trend, long-term trend? We decided to look at the long-term trend to see what that means. Here's what we learned, that in bachelor's degrees, the US has been more or less constant, slight increases, but the US isn't growing that dramatically. Therefore, supply and demand have been in equilibrium. India is in pathetic shape when it comes to bachelor's education. China, even though the numbers may be suspect, I've used the word bogus to describe the Chinese numbers. They're bogus in the right direction. They truly are increasing. The Chinese really have invested massively in education, and they've done many, many things right. The Chinese government is focused, and when they want something, they get it. Now, the issues of quality and so on, I'm going to discuss that more. But the fact is the Chinese did invest massively in science and engineering education since 1999. Masters. I have two lines over here for India, the MCA degree and the master's degree. The reason why I put MCA isn't a real degree. It's basically arts and science grads who want to become computer programmers, so they do these 2-year degrees. The reason why I put up there was because I was taking so much fire from India for being an anti-nationalist that I felt scared to step into India for a while, because I was saying such nasty things about the engineering education of the country. So I put it up there, just to keep them happy. But the fact is that India's master's education is pathetic. The numbers are unimpressive. China graduates more masters in engineering than does the United States. PhDs, my Indian friends want to feel sad. Look at these pathetic numbers. Less than 1,000 PhDs in engineering a year from India's schools. China is taking over the world. Now,
I think someone already asked this before. In terms of the US students, how many of them are international?
I'm going to answer that soon. That's going to be my next slide.
That kind of skews.
Right. I'll get to that. So if you go by this data, what should be happening right now is that China should become the R&D innovation capital of the world. India should have been a flash in the pan. The United States should be constant. That's what, if you go by the public discourse, the public debates, that saying it's all about engineering education and we need to invest more in K-12, do this, do that. If you go by those data, then that's what should be happening. Let me talk about what is happening. But before that, let me answer your question. These are the breakdown of degrees in the United States. Bachelor's, I mean, it's mostly American students or American-born students, Indian and Chinese, born over here and bachelor's level in engineering. 43% of the masters in 2005 were foreign nationals. 60% of the PhDs in engineering schools in the US were foreign nationals. Now, I'll tell you up front that I've got nothing against foreign nationals. Right? The problem is that if you bring foreign nationals over here, and then they go and add to the labor supply in countries that you're competing with, you've created a problem for yourself. Right? I'm going to tell you about why that is a reality and why we're really screwed. Okay. Now I'm going to sort of, I'm jumping around in time. Now I'm moving forward 2 years to talk about what's happening in globalization. The numbers tell the complete story. Despite everything I said bad about India, basically, after publishing all these things, for my tech days, I still knew the CEOs of many of the top companies in India. So despite the fact that the media hated me, those guys still knew me from my old days, and we made a trip there. We spent several weeks in India and China. I went there with Pete Engardio, who's a senior editor from Business Week. We put our Business Week hats on, went inside the labs of India and China to see what was going on there. What we saw was nothing less than mind-blowing. Despite the problems with education, Indian companies in every industry we looked at are becoming an R&D powerhouse. This is absolutely amazing. You go to the pharma industry, you have not hundreds, but tens of thousands of smart scientists doing drug discovery for American companies, for European companies. They're developing specialty pharmaceuticals, biologics, you name it, they're doing it there. And not only are they developing to American specifications, they're going way beyond that. You know, for example, heart patients in America take 4 medicines every day. And the medications cost hundreds of dollars every month for these patients. And Dr. Reddy's has developed what's called a polypill, one tablet that combines all 4 medications in one. And guess what the cost of that is going to be? So Americans, you're probably talking $10,000 to $20,000 of medicine for a heart patient per year. Guess what the Indian cost is? $30 per person per month for the polypill. Now what they did was that it was really innovative in the way they combined the medicines. They came up with this new pill. It's going to be released later this year. It's going to be released early next year. Aerospace. The most sophisticated components of jetliners from all over the world are being designed in Pune and Bangalore. Everything from the collision avoidance systems to the first-class cabins. You know, you go inside a jetliner, the first-class cabin is where airlines make most of their money. You go to TCS or HCL, you go to the labs, and they'll show you simulation rooms in which they're designing first-class cabins for airliners. It blew my mind that the Americans would outsource the most critical money, earning component of their airlines to India. But that's what they're doing. Consumer appliances, for example, the Palm Pre, the touch screen is supposed to be vastly superior to even the iPod, to the iPhone, the Kindle. Guess where the circuitry for all that was designed? In New Delhi at Freescale Semiconductor. I mean, no one has announced that the Kindle is an Indian product, but the Kindle was designed in India. Okay, so you look at the automotive industry. Not only are they developing the Tata Nano and the Riva, which is an electric vehicle, which is now going to be produced in the United States, they're also developing the dashboards for GM vehicles. They're developing the powertrains for Ford vehicles and so on and so on. I mean, the list goes on. Washers and dryers, refrigerators, they're all being done in India. It's not hundreds of people or thousands of people. It's hundreds of thousands of people who are involved in sophisticated R&D in India. This doesn't add up. China. What China has achieved in one generation is nothing less than magnificent. Never in the history of mankind.
I wanted to add one minor factoid on the India side.
Right.
IBM, I think worldwide, has roughly 300,000 employees. And 6 or 7 years ago, I think they had 4,000 or 5,000 employees in India.
Yeah.
I'm told now that they have 80,000.
They have 96,000 at last count.
So the overall employment of IBM has been roughly constant.
Yeah.
But the shift toward India has been massive in just 7 years or so.
Yeah. Cisco has gone from 400 people to 5,600 people. I mean, Microsoft has 5,400 people. I mean, just
96,000 people.
I know.
For IBM. Think about that. That would make
That's
it one of the
unbelievable.
top employers in all of India.
Absolutely. So now in China, okay, what China has achieved in infrastructure and in development is nothing less than mind-blowing. I mean, you've got to give them the highest credit for taking a third world society into an advanced nation within one generation. I mean, it's just amazing what the Chinese have achieved. But you start going inside the technology parks and look at the R&D that's happening there. There's no real R there. It's mostly imitation. What they're doing is they're copying, cloning Western technologies. So despite all of Chinese advantages in education and engineering and so on, they're basically still in imitation mode. They're not doing any research. American companies or multinationals rave about their Chinese labs. Microsoft, for example, makes a big deal about their Beijing labs. Beijing has 45 developers, 45 PhDs working there on 3 products. 2 of them are games. They're not doing any real research. The rest is all localization. So multinationals basically are taking their Western products and adapting to the Chinese market and claiming to be doing advanced research in China, but they're not doing it. They don't trust the Chinese government or the Chinese intellectual property laws, so therefore they're just not moving R&D to China, despite everything you read in the newspapers. This was a big surprise because I was so bullish about China when I started doing my research that people started thinking I was on the Chinese payroll. And then later on, I basically flipped my tune, saying that there's no real, in fact, I meant on the record saying China's imitating, not innovating. And I took a lot of fire from the Chinese for saying that. But when I met the heads of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, they agreed with me. They said, yes, this is a concern, and they have to get China beyond this. Okay. Now the question is, how did India achieve that success? This was really haunting me. So I spent 4 months in India, basically, almost full-time working on this project. And here's what we learned. First of all, most conservatively, being most nice to India, I would say that 50% of the engineering output of the schools is employable. That's a generous estimate. The IITs, which get all the credit for India's success, they graduate less than 5,000 engineers a year, all 7 IITs. The country looks like it's falling apart, right? Yet, in 2007, the top 5 IT companies hired 120,000 engineers. Accenture and IBM added 14,000 each in 2007. If you add it up, in that year, India graduated about 220,000 engineers. That's almost equal. These 7 companies hired almost all of India's output, not even discounting it by 50%. How did this happen? The answer is that the Indians did what the Japanese did in the 60s and 70s, that they adapted the best practices of the West and perfected them. What Indians did basically was that they mastered the art of workforce development. Just like the Japanese mastered manufacturing, and they rapidly became an industrial power, the Indians have done that with people. This is how they can do all that. And I'm going to tell you how they did it. For example, in workforce recruitment, when you folks graduate and look for a job, what are you going to do? You're going to put together a resume, right? You're going to get your friends to put it together. You're going to read all the books you can. You're going to use resume generators. At the end of the day, you're going to have a really pretty resume, right? What does the resume tell you? It tells you how good you are at putting together resumes. It doesn't reflect on your competence or your ability or your knowledge, especially in India. They're very good at fudging resumes, right? So the fact is, a resume is really not a measure of a person. Yet American companies rely upon the resume to screen out applicants. Microsoft gets something like 300,000 resumes a year. They only interview about 5% of the people that apply to them and hire a tiny fraction of that. So the resume basically is irrelevant. Well, guess what? The Indian companies figured this out. They said, resumes don't tell the story, so they started developing different methods of interviewing people, different methods of analyzing them. So you try applying for a job at Infosys, for example, one of India's leading companies. They'll put you through a battery of psychometric tests. They'll put you through a battery of interviews, and basically they'll judge you on your ability. They've also started doing bulk hiring from universities. For example, they'll cut a deal with professors saying that they'll hire the top 20% of the class. Whoever the professor recommends, they'll hire. Because at the end of the day, their guess is as good as anyone else's. And by building a relationship with the professors who know the students better, they can be sure of much higher quality. They've started hiring, for example, Genpact, which is India's largest BPO. They set up storefronts in 9 cities in India. So what happens is that if you want to work for Genpact, you walk into a storefront in a mall, and they have these DVDs and large screens telling you all about the company. You go there with your parents, you go there with your spouse, with your children, and you basically see what the company is all about. And then you meet the people on the spot. And if you look like you're halfway smart, they'll basically put you through training. And 3 months later, something like 80% of all the people who go through this training get a job at the company. Pretty smart. New employee training. In the 60s and the 70s, when you joined IBM USA, you would get 7 to 9 months of training, and then get 7 to 9 months of on-the-job training. So it was about 18 months before IBM expected their new employees to become productive. Join IBM today, guess how much you get? You get a day and a half of orientation, and that's it. You're expected to be productive. And then IBM's executives go around dumping on the education system, saying that our K-12 education is bad, the schools aren't graduating the right quality of engineers, and so on, because kids out of school don't have the perfect skills that IBM wants. In India, you join Infosys today, and they send you to the Mysore campus. Mysore campus can train 13,500 people at a time, okay? And those places are always full. You basically study 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, and they retrain you. By the time you come up there, you have the equivalent of a master's degree because they've retrained you in everything. Not only do they teach you the basics of Java programming or project management, they also teach you how to communicate. They teach you how to write project plans. They teach you how to write emails. The most basic skills you should have been taught in school, they retrain you on it, and they teach you in their centers. And the numbers are amazing. TCS, which is India's largest company, can train 30,000 people at a time. The size of these campuses is just unbelievable. They make Berkeley look like a small time campus. And the facilities are as nice as what you have in Berkeley. They have dominoes on site. You have squash courts. I mean, just amazing facilities at these training centers. Now, when you join, so training is one thing. When you join companies, that's when the training starts. That the type of ongoing skill development you get is unbelievable. Satyam is a bad name these days. It was acquired, but Satyam basically was moving towards, in the engineering division, they were moving towards mandating that every employee must get 150 hours of formal training per year. Mandatory. Okay. So, but all of the others typically require 1 to 2 hours of mandatory training per employee per year. Okay. And then they go much beyond that. I mean, for example, in Cadence India, the CEO of Cadence India instituted a rule which says that everyone above the level of architect, every manager, everyone above the level of architect, including the CEO himself, must spend 1 to 2 weeks a year delivering classroom training. So imagine joining a company, being in a classroom, having the CEO being your coach. Imagine the bonds you build up with the company. Imagine how much a CEO learns from new recruits that are coming to the company, right? So that's innovative. And then managerial development. When my Duke students graduate from the Masters of Engineering Management program, it typically takes them 8 to 8.5 years to get to project manager level in the companies that they join. In Infosys, Wipro, all of the top Indian companies, they do the same in about 3 to 3.5 years. And the managers that they hire there are better than the managers that we have over here, because they put them through intense training, career progression plans, and so on and so on. When you join business here, you get evaluated at the end of every year. And guess what those evaluations are for? They're for the company to cover their butts in case they have to fire you. Right? So those evaluations are entirely useless. All these schemes that they have for evaluating employees, absolutely completely useless. They're basically to protect the company from getting sued if they fire you. In India, at the end of every project, you get evaluated. They have ERP-like systems. All of these companies have amazing systems in which they track human resource development. They track the progression of people in their careers. So every time you get evaluated, they prescribe training for you. If you do that training and you pass it, you get an automatic salary increase. If you improve after 2 or 3 evaluations, you get a promotion. So you can predict what your increases are going to be based on the training that you received. And the company encourages you to take training, and then they pay for it as well. This is sort of unheard of in the United States. I'm not going to get into the university linkages. But if you look at, India has gotten a lot of, Indian companies have taken a lot of fire for having high attrition rates. The attrition rates of the top Indian companies are about half of their counterparts in the United States. And they've been staying steady and dropping. In fact, those have dropped to about half of that level over the time. So despite the fact these companies are growing at about 30 to 45% per year, every year, their attrition rates actually went down. So what that showed is that if you invest in your employees, you cut turnover, you improve performance, you improve productivity. This is the lesson that the Indians learned. It's all about investing in your workforce, making them innovative, making them productive. That's India's secret. All right, so what does this mean for the United States? We're screwed. Basically, what we need to do basically is we need to start looking at our strengths. I've looked at 3 areas. And everywhere I look, there are problems. Commercializing university research, immigration, entrepreneurship, all based on myths. For example, university research, I'm not going to spend more than 30 seconds on this. We spend close to $50 billion a year on university research. We get about $2 billion worth of value out of it. If a private company was doing that, they'd go bankrupt. But that's how the system works. There are a lot of side effects, a lot of good benefits from university research, but it isn't to create innovation. It isn't to create commercial companies or products or something. It's mostly an investment in education, which is fine, but we shouldn't go around pretending it's going to make the United States more innovative or competitive, because it's not. All it's going to do is educate the Indians and Chinese who are going to go back and start competing with us. That was a joke. All right, I'm going to talk about immigration right now. This is based on 5 major research projects. And I've written about this extensively. I've received 15 death threats so far, to put things into perspective. I've probably received 15,000 hate mail. There are websites devoted to attacking me. I mean, this is great. First of all, look at Silicon Valley. During the dot-com boom from 1995 to 2005, 52.4% of the startups are founded by immigrants, by people born abroad. Just think about it. Yeah, this, where you folks live would not have had half the number of startups if it wasn't for people who came here from abroad. Nationwide, it was 25.3%. A quarter of all the companies in America, even down south in the middle of nowhere, a quarter of the startups were founded by immigrants nationwide. In 2005, they employed nearly 500,000 workers and generated $52 billion in revenue. So all these xenophobes that are attacking me, make it, every time I write an article for TechCrunch, you can just sort of go there. I sort of wait for them to figure out that I've written an article, and they start blasting me and posting all sorts of garbage. And the editors of Businessweek and TechCrunch almost have to have people full-time sitting there weeding out all the garbage that's posted, because every time I write something, they want to attack me, no matter what I've written about. My last article was about faith and God in Silicon Valley. And guess what? There were about 15 posts to do with Vivek's views on immigration and how we're letting H-1B workers in and all this other crap. But what they miss is that just in 2005, the number of people that these immigrant-founded companies employed was 500,000. If you added up all the people that got green cards, all the foreign workers in the tech sector that got green cards in the decade before that, it was less than 450,000. It was probably about 300,000. So just looking at the data, taking it face value, these immigrants created jobs. Okay. Now, my Indian buddies are hyperactive at founding companies. The largest founding group were Indians. There's something to be said about them because they've somehow come here and they mastered the art of becoming Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Separate discussion. Question?
Did you figure out if they have received education here?
Yes, that's the next slide. I'm going to cover that. WIPO patents. A quarter of all the patents filed from the United States in 2006 had foreign nationals as co-authors, which is mind-blowing. And these aren't people like me, because in that time period of this study, I filed 4 patents, except I was a US citizen. So I wasn't counted as an Indian. I was counted as an American. People who've been in the United States who who filed patents, a quarter of them basically contributed to it. Now, I talked about the Indians being ahead of the Chinese in starting companies. The Chinese basically trounced the Indians in filing patents. That 17% of the patents had Chinese name authors, and about 14% in Indian names in 2006. And this increased 337% over 8 years. Now, I'm going to discuss what that means, because it's a sign that something is wrong with the system. Again, I have nothing wrong with foreign nationals, but the fact that the foreign national number increased so dramatically in such a short period of time was a red flag for me. Now, getting to your question about the background of these company founders, they tended to be very well educated. So everything bad I said about engineering education, delete that from the record. Engineering education gives you a huge advantage if you're going to become a successful entrepreneur, if you're going to be an innovator, if you're going to be progressing in your career. It may help you get a job in India. It may not make a difference in getting a job in India, but certainly helps you big time in becoming a successful Silicon Valley entrepreneur.
Is that a correlation or causal relationship? I mean, isn't it just possible that the sort of highly motivated people who head up certain companies are exactly the sort of people who, are going to get the top degrees and so on?
It could be. It could be, but like I said, when you looked at the background of those people who founded these companies, very highly educated. 3/4 of them had masters or PhDs in STEM-related fields: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So you can, like I said, you can do lots of follow-up research on this, but it was just interesting to note how well they were educated. More than half of them came here as students and decided to stay. Only 1.6% came here to start companies. The majority came here, like many of you did. Here's the problem. That when we looked at that number that backlog number, that foreign national patent number, we found was that this happened because we've been bringing in people on temporary visas. We never expanded the number of green cards. The result is that there are a million skilled immigrants and their families in the United States right now waiting for green cards. Guess how many visas are available every year for Indians and Chinese and any nationality? 8,400. So in that million number, there are about 350 to 400,000 Indians, 8,400 visas available per year. Guess how long it's going to take them for? If those of you who are foreign nationals here, if you graduate and decide to stay in the United States, just try to figure out how long it'll be before you can get a green card. In the meantime, you're stuck working for the same employer. If you change companies, the chances are you're going to get screwed and lose your turn in line. So you're going to continue working for the same company, being taken advantage of, and you're going to waste your most productive part of your life, working for an abusive employer. That's the reality of it. So the US is in big trouble. 2.5 years ago, I published a paper entitled Immigrants' Intellectual Property in the Reverse Brain Drain. And that reverse brain drain thing created a firestorm. I took so much criticism from academics for suggesting that there was a reverse brain drain. It was unbelievable. I mean, but I stuck to my ground. I wrote op-eds about it. I said that the US is going to experience its first brain drain in history. And here's why. So I was the only one saying it. Last 6 months, the Wall Street Journal has had 2 front-page articles. New York Times has had 1 front-page article. USA Today had 1 front-page article. Newsweek, Time Magazine, almost every major publication has had feature articles about the reverse brain drain that's in process. That anecdotal data, there's no hard data available, anecdotal data says that tens of thousands are returning home. The Chinese basically have published some numbers which are higher than even my estimates. I mean, one number that I heard said that 40,000 Chinese went back last year. Just mind-blowing numbers. For the United States, this is a big shock because this has been a country of immigrants. We've never, at the turn of the century, there were big debates about the Europeans that were coming here. The Europeans were resentful of America for attracting their best and brightest. So they talked about the brain drain that was happening in Europe of skilled immigrants to the United States. And then you had the Germans coming here. We had waves of Irish, Polish, and the best and the brightest from Europe coming over here. Then in the 60s and the 70s, you had a brain drain from China and from India. In fact, Indira Gandhi, who was India's prime minister, tried stopping IIT graduates from coming to the United States. She was trying to pass some laws to prevent them from leaving the country. It never happened, but that's how serious things were in India. Guess what's happening right now? That they're going back in record numbers, fueling the economies of India and China. And the United States, for the first time in its history, is experiencing the brain drain that other countries did. And it doesn't realize it yet. We still have arrogance like you won't believe. Senator Grassley and Durbin are concocting new legislation to restrict H-1B hiring, to restrict the number of immigrants and so on, just when they're going back in droves, which is the most stupid, bizarro immigration policy you could think of.
So are you saying that just the Indians are migrating here, are going back? Is there any, do you know the percentage of Americans that are leaving America to go work somewhere else?
No. In fact, there are no hard numbers on Indians and Chinese either. But my next slides are going to tell you why they went back and how they're doing. All right, so let me get to that. We actually interviewed 1,200 returnees to India and China and asked them a series of questions. Why did you come to the United States? They came here because education was great, quality of life was great, professional development was great, and so on and so on. It was a great place to come when they came here. Then we asked them, why did you go back? Look at this. They had better career opportunities in their home countries. Compensation wasn't better in their home countries, but they believed that their country would provide them with better professional opportunities. There was growing demand for skills. Indians and Chinese is what I've,
Who's questioning these?
We basically did a survey of 200 returnees to India and China. This was what this was based on. It was a detailed survey we did.
Is this like general engineers, or are they like high positions?
What we did was that we used LinkedIn. We found the major companies there, and then we looked into the backgrounds of those returnees, and then we contacted them. So it's a biased sample, biased in terms of professionals who were on LinkedIn, which tends to be a tech-savvy crowd, professional crowd, and so on. But there was some, we wanted to just get as much of an understanding as we could. Question?
So is 1 completely disagree and 5 completely agree?
Yeah, but basically 5 is extremely strong factor. 1 is not a strong factor. Basically, it ranked the factors. It was like extremely agree 100%.
Or extremely disagree?
What's that?
Or extremely disagree?
Yeah, so 2.5 basically means not here, not there. Right.
Have you had a survey of all the people who decided to stay here? Because
No,
you're
no.
mentioning about.
No, take this for what it's worth. It's basically one data point of a lot of returnees to understand why they went back. It's not perfect. Because a lot of people have challenged this study, and I said, take it for what it's worth. Right now, there's no data available on why people are going back. This is not scientific in the sense that we didn't look at perfect samples there, perfect samples here. We took one data point to understand why they went back. Questions?
Not data, but even anecdotally, like why are people going back? Is it because, like what I've heard from Indians is that, they're working for the Ciscos and Microsofts, and now they've finally gotten their green cards here, like the citizenship, so they have the option of coming back. So they're actually going, they want to test the waters
Agreed.
and then come back. So it's not like they're really doing anything
Yeah.
innovative for India, but it's mostly like.
It is, but let me get cover that more, because you're right. And a quarter of them who've gone back say they're going to come back, but 3/4 don't plan to come back, which is pretty amazing on its own. So this is why they went back. Then the question is, how have things been since you've been back? That's why you went back. How have you done since you went back? I mean, look at this. I mean, in terms of care of aging parents, closest to family, those are dominant factors which draw people back. They're going back because they miss their relatives. I mean, most of the Indians that went back felt guilty that their parents were aging and they couldn't look after them. So they want to be close to their parents. And as you said, that they have green cards, they have the option. They're saying, everyone goes back saying, look, I'll go and live there for 5 or 10 years. Things are good there. When my parents pass away, I can always come back to the United States. So that's the mentality of a lot of people who go back. And both the Indians and Chinese keep a foot in both doors. But like I said, 3/4 of them decided that this is home now. We're not going back to America. And amazingly in India, the returnees said that the emotional growth of their children was much better. Education was much better back in India than in the United States, which is a big surprise. But these people are doing really, really well back home. The only thing they weren't doing well was on absolute dollars. But a dollar goes along. I mean, the rupee goes a lot further in relative terms than does the dollar here. Professional comparisons, every measure you look at, they're doing much better back home. Here's more data. The average age of the returnees was pretty low. I mean, they went in their prime. 30 Indians, 33 Chinese, very highly educated, masters, PhDs. And they did really well. The number of senior management positions increased quite dramatically. They plan to start companies. All the worrisome indicators for the United States. We asked 1,200 students in the United States in October of last year. It's, again, a snapshot on Facebook. Tell us about how you feel about the US, India, United States. The stay rates for Indians and Chinese has historically been very high. 92% of Chinese PhDs, 85% of Indians have stayed permanently. When we asked them that, very few Indians and Chinese, and relatively few Europeans want to stay here permanently. They're all talking about going back home. You ask them, where do they think that the future is? Look at the numbers. 86% of the Indians thought that the future was brighter back home than here. This is a big change. When I joined Duke 5 years ago, nearly all of my students talked about staying in the United States. I just spoke to the outgoing class last week. Virtually all of them were talking about going back to India within 1 to 2 years at the most. No one wants to stay in the United States anymore. All right, in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to try to cover entrepreneurship very, very fast. I've done extensive research on what makes entrepreneurs tick, and this is based on 3 different projects. I'm just going to roughly go through some of these points. First of all, tech entrepreneurs aren't young. The people who found companies are typically about 40 years of age. There are twice as many over 50 as there are under 25. There are twice as many over 60 as there are under 20. So this myth about entrepreneurs being, tech entrepreneurs being young is simply a myth. They're married with children. The majority of them had married and they had more than one child. Entrepreneurs don't come from rich families. This is intuitive, that those that come from poorer families tend to be more motivated to succeed. If you have rich parents, you've had it good your whole life, why would you worry about making it big? You already have enough money. It's those who didn't have who want to share the American dream, basically want to make it big. Very highly educated, they're not college dropouts. You can just look at the data here. They tend to be much better educated than their parents. Pretty smart in high school, but their grades. I'm sure you folks can relate to this. Typically, these entrepreneurs did much better in high school than they did in college.
I think it was social network development.
All right. Academics have different explanations than I do. I just cut to the core. It's all about drinking. Now, this is another interesting thing. I actually have written about this and got a number of my friends at Duke and Harvard really pissed off at me for being so vocal about the issue. That this is the number of average sales and the employment generated by these companies. The difference between, this is the average, this is the Ivy Leagues. The difference between average and not having a degree is huge. So in other words, if you have a degree, you're likely to be much more successful than if you don't have a degree. The difference between the Ivy Leagues and regular is not much, considering this is an average. So for all the money you spend at the in the elite universities, you really don't get it back in terms of your success rates. This is very high-level data. I'm interpreting it, and academics will rip my head off for coming to conclusions like that based on the data that I have. But that's what my conclusion is, that it's overrated. Entrepreneurs tend to be highly experienced. I mean, the vast majority of them had more than 11 years of experience when they started their companies. So in other words, entrepreneurs come from the workforce. So what does that mean as a policy? Policy, if you want to foster entrepreneurship, boost the economy, you don't go to the business plan contests in high schools or in universities. You go to the workforce. Because what happens is that people come to a stage in their lives that they've saved some money, that they feel motivated to build wealth before they retire, and they get fed up of working for others. Question?
Are these like startups like who have been found, or like how can we know if they succeeded or not after 2 years or 3 years?
What we did basically was this sample was based on, we went through one source. We looked at companies that had gotten out of the garage, basically, that had achieved some level of success, that had real revenue.
Okay.
And then we interviewed their founders to look at their background. So the sample has a survivor bias, is the right word to put it. But that's why we called it making it a successful entrepreneur. I put that in the title to make sure that it was understood that we were reporting on successful companies. Most of them didn't come from entrepreneurial families. Many of them were first-time entrepreneurs in their families. Why did they become entrepreneurs? Because they wanted to build wealth. They wanted to capitalize on business ideas. They always wanted to start a company. Basically all over the map. That's what this chart says. That there were many reasons. It wasn't just about wealth. It wasn't just about idea. That there were many motivations for starting companies. This one, actually, I'm in the middle of a nasty. Boston Globe today has a big article, basically, attacking me for saying that Silicon Valley left Route 128 in the dust. I started off by saying that, have you heard of Route 128? Neither has anyone in Duke, neither has anyone at Harvard, neither has anyone at Berkeley. That most people in the world don't know what Route 128 is. If you look at this chart over here, what it shows is that only 30%, 29% of the graduates of Massachusetts University stay in there. In other words, no one wants to stay in Boston when they graduate. The Harvard grads end up coming to Silicon Valley. 70% of the Silicon Valley crowd, of the California crowd, start their companies in California. This has some interesting regional implications. Now, all this noise about venture capital, the vast majority of entrepreneurs didn't raise venture capital. Money came from personal savings.
And these again were successful ones.
Successful entrepreneurs, yes.
So again, you would expect this would be biased in favor of venture capital,
Yes.
given that you were
Yes.
looking at the ones that made it.
Yes, exactly.
Question over here.
I was just going to ask are you saying that only 14.2% of the subscribers ever raised VC, or?
No, what happens is that you always have multiple sources of financing for your company, right? So basically we actually asked them over the life of multiple companies, where did they get them, how did they raise money?
Their initial money, or?
For that company, at the stage that they were at, what were the sources of capital? The number for first-time startups for venture capital is actually, this was an average. I don't have the slides here, but the first-time companies was 10.8%. Okay. For serial entrepreneurs that had started several companies, it went up to about 20% who raised venture capital. That still says 80% of these successful entrepreneurs did not raise venture capital. That's very significant.
This was by amount or by,
We didn't ask them. We just said, for your company, what were the sources of financing?
Okay.
Yeah, because I didn't want to get that deep. I just wanted high-level information. Success factors. Why did companies succeed? Prior work experience was by far the strongest factor. 4.4 out of 5 is very significant. Lessons learned from success and failure, company's management team, and good fortune. I just wrote an article for TechCrunch, which was titled God is your co-pilot, and something about stock up your piggy bank. Basically, the theme of the article was that I was surprised how high good fortune was on the list of success factors. And actually, if you looked at failure, and so, these numbers basically, didn't take into account the not applicables because about 14% of the entrepreneurs said that they hadn't experienced failure. So if you discounted for that, people gave failure more credit for success in their startups. So it was basically, it was work experience, management, and luck were the key factors which made them successful. Obstacles faced by entrepreneurs. This is another surprising thing. If you look at the numbers, they're really, really low. These entrepreneurs tend to be very optimistic bunch. That the only real obstacle that they said was the amount of time required. Nothing else stopped them. Entrepreneurs basically look at the world, through a very bright prism. We asked them what stopped their peers from becoming entrepreneurs. In other words, when I started my first company, I know that people are left behind why they didn't start companies. So basically, we asked their opinion on why others didn't start companies. And the number one factor by far was willingness, ability to take risks, which makes sense. That most others, who didn't start companies or become entrepreneurs were afraid of failure. The amount of time required, difficulty in raising capital, experience, and so on and so on. All right, I'm going to conclude and then do Q&A. So what do I think we should do? First of all, globalization, it's going to happen. That if we start erecting trade barriers, we'll go the way of Venezuela, and we'll go the way of third world countries, basically, because protectionism will not solve the problem. Industries will be wiped out by globalization. There's no stopping it. It has happened in the past. It's going to happen in the future. So the only thing that the US can do is to keep investing in its workforce, to learn from the Indians, basically, to start moving its people up the ladder, to teaching them, making them more productive, teaching them diverse skills, and basically adapting to the changes that globalization will bring. When you bring immigrants in, don't bring them in on these stupid H-1B visas. If someone is smart enough and is educated enough to get a job in the United States, give them a green card. Don't waste their productive lives in being indentured servants, because that's what H-1B visa essentially turns workers into. If we're going to invest in university research, make it more effective. My argument.
You're saying that for anybody who gets a master's or a PhD, green card.
Absolutely. I mean, these kids. Why should? I mean, they have strong ties back in India and China and Poland and Venezuela. Basically, their relatives want them to come back. They can probably get good jobs over there. They're the cream of the cream. These are top-notch graduates, right? So why not stack the deck by giving them a green card? Because what will happen is that they'll end up getting a job here. They'll end up falling in love. They'll end up getting married, having kids here, and then it becomes very hard to go back to India or China. So basically, time is on our side. Rather than putting them through all these hurdles and having senators and Lou Dobbs and God knows who else haranguing them and talking about how immigrants are bad, they're taking our jobs away, all this crap. We want people like this here. We want them competing on our side, not against us, which is what they're going to do if they go back to their home countries. So research, my view is that we shouldn't invest any more in basic research. Fine, we're investing $50 billion, keep it. The next $5 or $10 billion, put it into translational research. Invest it in the research commercialization system, fixing it, and giving the researchers the money necessary to build prototypes and to take their ideas into invention. Right now, the system doesn't work that way. And then if we're going to foster entrepreneurship, as I said earlier, screw these business plan contests. Focus on the workforce. Set up entrepreneurship boot camps for workers within companies. Teach them how to start companies, give them seed funding. When they get unemployed, go to Detroit and set up massive training boot camps. Provide 3-month scholarships for anyone who goes to one of these entrepreneurship boot camps. We're paying unemployment. Instead of unemployment, let's pay them for education. Right? So that's the sort of creative thinking that the United States will have to do to get itself out of the rut that it's in. And then we have to realize that innovation is going to happen abroad. There's so much now happening in India. There's so much happening in China. There's so much happening in Brazil. There's so much happening in Chile. You go across the world, there's a lot happening there. American companies, for example, HP gets 69% of its revenue from overseas right now. IBM gets 67% of its revenue from overseas. Caterpillar gets 67% of its revenue from overseas. GE gets 51% of its revenue from overseas. So these aren't American companies anymore. They're foreign companies who happen to be based in America. And they're going to be developing innovative new products in foreign lands. Let's learn from those lands and bring the technologies over here. Our kids, instead of teaching more math and science, I keep arguing we need to teach geography. Most Americans don't know where Brazil is on the map. Yeah. Most Americans, don't know anything about foreign cultures. They know nothing about them. Well, guess what? When they join the workforce, they're going to be developing products for these foreign countries without having a clue what these countries are. Let's start teaching them about the world. And let's start putting the mechanisms in to steal all we can from China. Steal it back if we can. Learn all we can from India. So we need to have a different mindset in terms of being able to exploit all the good things that are happening globally, because the world has changed. Bottom line is we need to compete on our strengths. We have many, many advantages. We have free society. We have innovative people. I can go on about all the great things about America. We need to do what we do better. Rather than trying to focus on India and China and compete with them and graduating engineers, let's focus on innovation. Let's focus on our strengths. I rattle off all sorts of data. You can find all of my research on this website. There are probably about 15 or so academic papers, typically between 50 and 100 pages with all sorts of stats in them. They're not written like academic papers. There's no calculus in them. There's no standard preamble, which makes it unreadable. They're mostly readable, interesting papers. All right, questions. We have 15 minutes of questions. Yes.
You cited a lot of examples of R&D work going on in India, but my belief is that most of the R&D work is for the big companies which are based in the US. So
100%.
it's not really, even if you say this innovation is happening in India, it's really not for the Indian markets. Whereas if you look at China, most of the innovation that's happening, they don't care two hoots about making anything for the US, but it's more for the local market. And I guess that's why the Chinese are doing so your argument that maybe India is headed in that
all right. Now, let's focus on that, because that's a great observation she made, and what she's saying is absolutely correct. That almost all of the R&D happening in India, first of all, it's not reported, so you don't see it on the things. It's owned by American companies. Americans own the intellectual property, and it benefits America. So that's absolutely correct. But what's going to happen 5 years from now? The typical tenure of these people is about 10 years working in the same company or working in similar companies. Indians aren't different than Americans in entrepreneurship. In fact, they're more entrepreneurial than Americans are. The people that have made it here are more entrepreneurial than are the natives on a like-to-like basis. It's a select group, okay? But the fact is that the tech crowd over there is the same as the tech crowd that came over here. They're going to get fed up of working for their bosses. They now have experience. They have now built innovative technologies. They understand Western markets. They've saved a lot of money. These people at Cisco and IBM are making 2 or 3 times what other people are over there. The same dynamics apply over there. And this is why my second to last TechCrunch article talked about how India was going to become a global R&D hub, and I actually concluded it and got even the Indians pissed off with it. I said 5 years from now, if you took a like sample of Indian companies and Silicon Valley companies, they'll be head to head, because it's the same people who now have extensive experience. So you'll start seeing the spillover into startups and private industry. It's already happening. There are a lot of really, really interesting startups. I just went there 3 weeks ago and met about 105 startups over there. And 5 or 10 of them were just amazing, amazing companies. So much so that they were doing things better than their counterparts in Silicon Valley. So give it time.
I was just going to say, too, I haven't spent as much time in India as you have, but the few companies in India that I have met are really wonderful companies.
Yeah.
Very well managed. Tata Group in particular,
I
think is as good a company as any I've seen anywhere in the world.
Exactly.
So they may not be selling to the Indian market yet, but they're not by no means under the thumb of the U.S. multinationals.
Yeah.
This is already a global company, but based on the quality of people that I saw, it is already a world-class company.
Absolutely, and I believe that if American companies are going to do R&D in India, they should own the intellectual property. That the benefit to India is its people get smarter. They get good jobs there. And over time, they have the spillover effects. There's no reason why why Indians should own that intellectual property. It's not their money, right? Question?
You studied, do any analysis about American-born people that are also going and doing their
No.
Because you're doing this, your comparison is American, but
Well, the study on entrepreneurship was almost all American-born. In the last paper I published called Making a Successful Entrepreneur, 17% were foreign-born, but 83% were Americans. So that on entrepreneurship, I focused on Americans in America. I haven't looked at Americans going abroad. The numbers are so small and insignificant.
No, but not going abroad. I'm saying just American-born engineers that are being graduated from engineering companies, from
Yeah, all of the entrepreneurship research was that sample you talked about, what American Born.
Entrepreneurship, just working in an engineering firm, because you keep making all these, saying about foreign people that are coming here and working here and then going back. But how many of the United States people that are being raised here, becoming engineers, and then going to engineering?
I don't know. I mean, I've done a lot of work for the last, for 5 years of my tenure in academia. I've published a lot of shit here already.
Another question, please.
Well, I've heard, I don't know, the other day, I'm not sure how true this is, but I heard that American companies sometimes like the fact that H-1B visas are limited and
Yeah.
they lobby to keep that way because it's hard for people to switch jobs, which is kind of nice for their attrition rates.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, like, A, is that true? And like,
It's
B,
true.
like how would you kind of get around the fact that you have these huge like powerhouses lobbying?
When I first started talking about it, I was on a yelling match with Bill Gates's crony on Seattle radio, in which basically we were at each other's throat, because I said exactly that basically the reason why Bill is lobbying for H-1B visas and not green cards is because they're indentured servants. And I made many, many strong statements because this is true. What happened was that these people gave up and they started to change their tune. The last 2 years or so, if you read all the messages from the tech lobbying industries, they're exactly in sync with me. They're now talking about green cards because they were fighting a battle which they couldn't win. Right. So, but now everyone is talking about green cards and keeping people on permanent visas, but they also talk about H-1B visas. But like I said, it's going to come up again in the next 6 months or so. Once healthcare is over, the next battle is going to be about immigration. But my fear is it's going to be about illegal immigration versus skilled immigration. But question?
You cast this as the U.S. versus India versus China. To what extent do these people really see themselves, perhaps as sort of Richard Florida's transnational global creative class? They may slosh around the world for every opportunity to the class.
Yeah, you're right. That's something which Annalise Saxon has written a lot about. She's my mentor over here. You're right. There's a lot of that happening. But I've been looking at it in black and white as much as I can. It's us versus them. That's been the focus of my research. What does it mean for the United States? But a lot of it is people going back and forth and both countries benefiting. Question?
So to that point, if you're an engineering graduate student or whoever graduating now, and you have entrepreneurial aspirations, what is the best path to gaining the experience over the next 5-10 years? Is it to go and work in an Indian company to get that for 3.5 years, like to management experience and then coming back, or what would you?
If I was an Indian student, right now they have no choice because they can't get visas, they can't get jobs, they're all headed back. So I used to advise students 3 or 4 years ago when things were good, I used to advise them to join the big companies for a few years, gain some experience, and then become entrepreneurs. So I advise my American students who can't get jobs right now, go right into entrepreneurship, go and fail, because you are going to fail. But that'll be 2 years of great experience which will help you in your future. 2 years from now, you can probably join a Motorola or Cisco or whatever with the experience that you have. And you can start a company 5 years later, which will probably be successful. But for the Indians and Chinese and other foreign nationals, they're screwed. They have no choice but to go back.
What about American?
American bonds have all the opportunities, but they're not getting jobs either. This is why I just met about 15 students just last week, and my advice to them was get together and start companies, because it's better than being unemployed and getting depressed, especially in the research. There are lots of jobs here, but in RTP there aren't that many jobs. It's outside Silicon Valley, you don't have the vibrancy that you have over here. Right.
A question about India's demographic dividend. I think around 60% of the population is 25 years or less. And then when we're talking about how the big companies are kind of proxy universities and they are doing the best job of educating people. So what's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 years if India doesn't really succeed in building up its education infrastructure, and we're going to have these hundreds of millions of people who are working age, the social unrest, and what.
Yeah, you're right. India could become a Pakistan if they don't get their education system fixed and start spreading the opportunities. Absolutely. So they've got to fix the education system. I was at the Yale CEO Summit 2 weeks ago in Delhi when Kapil Sibal, is that the education minister? I basically ripped into him, and when Montek Singh Ahluwalia was there as well. I said the same things I'm saying over here, and they got very defensive. But eventually they did agree with it. They said, yes, we do have to improve education, and they're well aware of it. So yeah, there are risks for India if they don't fix their system.
So I'm a graduate student in chemistry. I do probably some of the most basic fundamental research that
about commercializing education. It seems to me like if you start to do that, you're going to create a generation of people that, it's kind of culturally bankrupting. And how are you going to have scientists that are really motivated to solve problems like global warming and disease if they're focused on career development and making money?
You're right that we want scientists fixing the problems of global warming and so on, but the problem is that you're in one of the best universities in America, working with very highly dedicated researchers. You go outside the top universities, and you'll find that most of the projects that they're doing are basically so that these academics can get tenure. They're not doing research for the sake of improving, global warming and so on. They're writing publishing papers so they can get it on their resume and get tenure in the university. So a lot of it is being wasted. So if everyone was like, you and your team, you wouldn't have me complaining about it. So it's not consistent. That's what the problem is.
Let's take one more question.
Going back to the workforce development, when you said that should be adopted, I was thinking more along the lines of the quality of education. Though India trains less engineers as compared to the Chinese, are there any differences between the quality of education that they get at the engineering level that makes workforce development easier to adopt for them?
Chinese education may today be better than Indian education in engineering. If they have invested in it, they funded it, they're probably educating higher quality engineers right now, overall in numbers than India is, because the government has been focused on it. The Indian government has been playing politics with it. They believed all this nonsense about India's great education system, so they started implementing quotas. So every politician basically wanted to get their caste, more preferential treatment and get some stupid school their region funded and so on. They've basically been destroying the education system in India. India is moving backwards. India has been moving backwards. There's hope that they'll start moving forward again in education.
Well, I think you will join me in thanking Vivek for a very provocative talk. Vivek, thank you so much.